Now let's see how to fetch data from our Firestore database. We'll take a look at how to fetch data from a collection as well as individual documents. So let's first see how to fetch all of the data associated with a given collection, namely our users collection. So assuming your app is running and you want to follow along, note that this is just a demonstration. It's not necessary that you write all the same code that I do. This is just for showing you the basic concepts for working with our database. If your app's up and running, you can head to a given page that we're displaying within our app, such as Timeline. And to fetch our data, we can first of all do so within a state class. But before we do that, we're going to need to reference our Firestore instance. So up at the top, we can just say firestore.instance. And in order to use Firestore, we need to bring in the Firestore, the Cloud Firestore package that's listed in our pubspec.yaml file. You should get an auto import suggestion. When you do, you can say firestore.instance, and from this we're going to be able to reference our created documents and collections. How we want to fetch our data is by using the initState method when our state is created. And the pattern that we're going to use for fetching all of our data is first by creating a reference. So we're going to take firebase.instance.collection. I'm sorry, this should be Firestore. And then we can select the collection ID as a string. So remember, we named that users. So now we have our users ref. So we can put this in a final variable called users ref that's of type collection reference. Most of the time I'll leave out that type declaration, and generally speaking you can move it up to the top of your file like so. So now if we need to reuse the users ref, it's available as this final variable. So we want to get our user data from this collection when we initialize state. So let's create a function called getUsers that will do that in. So we'll write out getUsers, and to fetch all of our data we can say usersref.getDocuments. This getDocuments method returns a future that needs to be resolved, a future that contains what's known as a query snapshot. So to resolve this future, we know we need to add on a then, and within the parameters to the then function, we're going to get access to what's known as a snapshot. This is of type query snapshot, and we refer to it as a snapshot because it gives us a snapshot, so to speak, of our data at that instance in time when we actually get our documents. Our snapshot contains our data as well as information about it, some meta information. And remember that our collection consists of a number of individual documents. So we can get our data from snapshot.documents. But note that whenever we're getting a collection of documents, these documents are going to be provided to us as an array or as a list. So we need to take the list that we're given on documents, and to actually get our data for each of the users we have to iterate over it using the for each method. This is just one approach to getting our data. So we could say for each doc, and this doc is of type document snapshot. We can get the data on it by using the reference doc.data. So for now we'll just print that line. And when you've got all that, we can save our timeline, and when our timeline loads, we should be able to go to our debug console and scroll down, and we see all of our data. We see the data for both of the documents. The first one, the user with the username Fred, and all of his data, and then the user with the username Jane. So let's review very quickly, because that might have been a bit confusing. We wanted to get all of our user data on our users collection. So what did we do? Well, first of all, we created a reference called usersref where we pointed to that collection. We got that data by executing off of the usersref getDocuments, which is a method available to every collection. We resolved the future that it returned with a then statement, and this future resolves to a query snapshot. And then all of the documents off of that collection were made available on the snapshot reference off of the documents property, which is a list. All of our documents are available on a list from a collection. So we use the for each method to iterate over each document snapshot, and the data was made available from doc.data. Now, just to show you a couple of more values for each document snapshot, we can also print the document's ID, that auto-generated ID, with the property document ID, and we can also get information, meta information, such as whether this exists by saying document.exists. So when we save and run that again, we can see in our debug console each of the user documents IDs and that they exist. Now, what if we want to get just a single document off of a collection? For example, we just wanted to get the user with the username of Jane. Well, in this case, an easy approach to getting a single document is to query for it by its ID, or to create a reference for it by its ID. So we just need to modify our users ref, and now instead of executing a method called getUsers, we can just comment this out, and we can create a function called getUserById, for example. So let's create this function. And we're going to take the user's ref as before, and we can chain on to this a document reference. So after we specify the collection users, we can choose a document with this document method. So we need to provide to document, which will chain on to the user's ref variable. The most common way of getting a document is to provide a reference to its ID. So let's find the ID for the user that we want to get with the username of Jane. We'll just copy that. We'll hard code this value for now, and we'll put it in a final variable of type string called ID, and pass that ID to the document method. In order to get this document, we need to call get. So to get an individual document, we call get, the get method. For getting a collection of documents, it's get documents. So again, get returns a future, but this is of type document snapshot instead of query snapshot. So we'll add our then, and within the parameters of that function, we'll get our document of type document snapshot, and we'll have access to all the same properties as we saw before. So once again, let's just print all of these lines like this, and we'll save. Let's see what we get when we visit our timeline, head to the debug console, and we see we get all of Jane's data just like we did before. So that's a quick overview for fetching data from our Firestore database. And before we wrap this up, I want to show you just one alternative syntax for making these requests that I think you're going to like a bit more than using the standard then and catch error callback approach. So in order to resolve these futures, instead of chaining on then, what we can do is make each function that we want to resolve a future an async function. So before the function body, we just add the keyword async, and instead of having then, we can comment this out. We can resolve our future, since this is an async function, by adding the keyword await in front of this expression. And once we await this future to resolve to its value, which is in this case is a document snapshot, we can put it in a variable like so, instead of having to reference it in the parameters of a separate function. So we immediately get back in a single line our document, and from there we can do whatever we like with it. So again, we'll print all of our user data. This time let's grab the other user, Fred's, data. So we'll copy his ID and try this out. So let's flip back to timeline, and when that runs, when our state's created, we get Fred's data. So we see this is a much cleaner, much more flattened way to resolve our futures. We can use the same async await syntax for get users as well, and this is the approach that I'm going to be taking for working with and getting data for both individual documents and collections.